Welcome to CE One-on-One. Today our subject is the Afghanistan War. I have a distinguished guest, Michael Kugelman. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure, it's great to be here. I'm the Senior Program Associate at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, a think tank in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to you. Do you think the Afghanistan War can end smoothly?
No. One thing that we've learned over history is that the United States and really other big powers are much better at starting wars than they are at ending them. And we've seen this through what happened in the war in Vietnam, for example. This war in Afghanistan, the easy part came when we went in 2001 and overthrew the Taliban regime. And after that, it's gotten a lot more difficult. Afghanistan is a country that has really never had strong central institutions. It's never really had strong central security forces, and the government is very weak. And really, the U.S. wants Afghanistan to be on its feet and help defeat this Taliban insurgency. And the U.S. military is going to be leaving for the most part at the end of 2014, but it's going to be a lot more difficult just for the war to end. Certainly on the battlefield, that will be very difficult. But in terms of whether there could be some sort of political process, a peace process that would end the war, I don't see that happening anytime soon, unfortunately. But the reality of it is, at the end of this year, most U.S. troops will be out of Afghanistan, regardless of what's happening, regardless of what's happening with the war.
During the war, have ever Taliban offered like a negotiation talk with U.S. troops?
Well, the Taliban a number of times has said that it would be interested in negotiating with the U.S. government to end the war. The problem, though, is that the Taliban is a very difficult organization to read. You don't know who's really making the decisions. If the Taliban says it's interested in talks, does the supreme leader echo that view? So it's very complicated. And also, the United States has always wanted other players to be at the peace table. It wants the Afghan government to be there. And the Taliban has never really been clear as to whether it wants the Afghan government to be involved in these talks. And at the end of the day, anytime you hear rumors about talks or in being encouraged to happen, they don't really pan out. And really, the way I feel now, with the United States on its way out, with the international troop presence on its way out of Afghanistan, what reason would the Taliban have to want to have peace talks? I think it feels it can just wait. And then when the U.S. and the other international troops have left, the Taliban can return to the battlefield.
What do the U.S. troops deal with Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
Well, U.S. troops are dealing with a very difficult, unpredictable enemy. It's one thing for a country to fight another country in a war, but these wars are very unusual. It's very unusual when one country's military fights another country's military. With the Taliban and with Al-Qaeda, you have non-state forces, fighters, that have a very different style, very different strategies than nation-state militaries. So, for example, the Taliban, as an insurgent group, it oftentimes will have its troops blend into civilian areas, which makes it much more difficult for U.S. troops or any other international troop contingent to go after it. You need to think twice before launching an attack on a base, for example, just because insurgents, particularly the Taliban, they like to blend in with civilians, and the U.S. military has no interest in causing civilian casualties. Of course, they happen. For sure, but it doesn't want these things to happen. And so it makes the Taliban very difficult. And also it understands the terrain in Afghanistan. It's a very mountainous, difficult place to fight. So it makes things very difficult for U.S. troops.
What are the relations of Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
Well, they certainly are very, very good and very close. It was the Taliban, when it was in power in Afghanistan, that allowed Al-Qaeda to use Afghanistan as a sanctuary. So really, the Taliban has been Al-Qaeda's host. Now, of course, in recent years, the Al-Qaeda has really doesn't have as much of a presence in Afghanistan as it used to, because the Taliban government was overthrown. But one thing that is still very clear is that the leaders from both of these institutions stay in touch. There was information that came out of, that was found in Osama bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad in Pakistan after he was apprehended and killed. There was information, documents, that showed that Osama bin Laden was in communication with the leadership of the Afghan Taliban, including pretty close to before bin Laden was killed. So certainly there's a lot of ideological convergences and a lot of reason for them to be close, and they still do remain close, even if not necessarily on an operational level. If they're not carrying out attacks together, that doesn't really happen, but certainly there's a lot of moral support, a lot of ideological support, and a lot of communication. So these are two formidable foes that are still very, very close.
How well does the Karzai administration have managed in Afghanistan?
It's a tough thing to answer. I think that the Karzai government and the Afghan government, the Afghan security forces, are really, when it comes down to it, very weak. They certainly have been strengthened in the last few years, particularly the security forces. But you're asking specifically about Karzai. Unfortunately, this is a government that's been so racked by corruption and inefficiency that really nothing has gotten done. It's been very dependable on, or very dependent on international financing and assistance from the United States and other countries, and yet still you look at what's happening. If you see surveys, polls in Afghanistan, a lot of Afghans, most Afghans hate their government, and many would prefer the Taliban. And you could argue that until there is a more effective, less corrupt government in Afghanistan, there's no reason to think that the insurgency will end, because there'll always be people within the Afghan population that are willing to throw their lot, so to speak, in with the Taliban. So really, I think there's a lot of good reason to look forward to elections, which are going to be happening later this year in Afghanistan, and hope that there'll be a government that's a bit more effective and a lot less corrupt.
So what is the future in Afghanistan you expect?
Well, it depends on several factors. One being really what happens after 2014. If there's an agreement signed between the U.S. and Afghanistan, then that will allow the U.S. to maintain some troops in Afghanistan after this year. And I think if that happens, the situation on the ground may not be quite as chaotic, because there would be about 10,000 U.S. international troops, mostly American, that would be in a position to help maintain some stability. And that could suggest that things wouldn't be quite as bad as they could be. If there's no agreement and if there's no U.S. troop presence in Afghanistan at all after this year, I really worry. Another thing, going back to what I said before, there's an election this spring in Afghanistan. And the outcome of that election will go a long way toward suggesting or toward saying what will happen in Afghanistan next year. I mean, if the election is free, fair, credible, if a new government comes to power that's seen as legitimate, I think that could really stabilize things. And it could really potentially reduce recruitment to the Afghan Taliban insurgency, just because if people believe in their government, they trust in it, especially if it's less corrupt and more effective, then that'll help, and it could really weaken the insurgency for sure. And then finally, really the state of the security forces in Afghanistan will go a long way toward determining the future of Afghanistan. I mean, as I said before, there have been a lot of improvements in the sense that they've received training and capacity has really been enhanced thanks to international training. But at the end of the day, a number of troops, quite a few Afghan security forces are illiterate. They're addicted to drugs. You hear about them deserting their units. And perhaps the most serious thing, the Afghan security forces are vulnerable to penetration by the Taliban. So there have been cases of Taliban forces pretending to be Afghan troops and then getting in there and causing problems, killing Afghan troops, killing Americans. So really, if the security forces improve and if things get better there, then certainly that's another reason to think that the future could be a bit more optimistic for Afghanistan. But unfortunately, I'm not optimistic.
What is the core objective of U.S. policy?
Yeah, see, this is a good question, and no one really knows what the core objective is with U.S. policy in the war. And this is one of the reasons why I think the war has become so unpopular and why it's been dragged out. They've never been clearly defined. In recent years, it was different when the war first started. But we've heard various things about what the objective is. We've heard that it's to help support democracy in Afghanistan. We've heard that it's quote-unquote nation building. And now, really, what we've been hearing from the Obama administration is a very vague thing about promoting stability or bringing about stability in Afghanistan. And I don't really know what that means. Does anyone know what that means? Does that mean that we have stability like in the United States, or does it mean stability like we'd have in any country that's going through a war, to the sense that things attain some minimum modicum of stability where people can get around, economic activity can happen even as violence continues? It's never, this distinction has never been made clear by the U.S. government, and I think it's unfortunate, and it's really unfortunate for the troops too, because they don't really know what they're fighting for at the end of the day.
What is the main reason for U.S. troops going to the war?
Yeah, well, this is an easier question to answer, because we know, I mean, people forget now. I mean, this war has been going on for what, 13 years now, almost 13 years. There was a very clear and obvious reason why U.S. troops entered Afghanistan, and that was because one of the most traumatic events in U.S. history, the 9/11 attacks in September 2001, essentially led by U.S. troops to go into Afghanistan. And that's because Afghanistan is where Al-Qaeda, which is the group that carried out the 9/11 attacks, was based. And so the objective in October 2001, when we went into Afghanistan, was to remove the government in Afghanistan, the Taliban government that was providing sanctuary to Al-Qaeda. So the idea was to remove the Taliban from power and to remove Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, so that Afghanistan could never again become a sanctuary for Al-Qaeda. Now, of course, the question today is if that's been achieved, and I think to make a long story short, it has for now, but I worry about what could happen after the troop presence leaves in Afghanistan in a few years.
Do the additional force that President Obama ordered to Afghanistan helps a lot?
Mm-hmm. Well, this was back in 2009, I think. He ordered this surge of troops. And I think it has helped in the sense that it brought in a lot more manpower, and it allowed the U.S., working with Afghanistan, to reduce the reach of the insurgency in Afghanistan, to the point that at one point it was pretty focused throughout the country. But now the insurgency is really reduced to the south and the eastern parts of Afghanistan, near the Pakistan border. But then again, I think it's important to remember that when Obama announced this surge of troops into Afghanistan, the same speech he announced the surge, he also announced that they would start to be withdrawn at a certain period of time. So, in effect what this did is, I think it really emboldened the Taliban, because it's sitting here watching the President of the U.S. saying that he's going to be sending troops into Afghanistan, a lot of them, but he's going to be pulling them back out in a very clear period of time. So I think that the Taliban was able to think, well, this is good. Sure, there'll be a lot more troops coming in, but we just need to maintain our gains and really tread water, and then wait for the day that they leave, and then we continue our fight. So I think that's what it comes down to there.
Yeah. What are the strategies of U.S. troops on the war? Do they now play the supporting role?
Yes. Over the last year or so, the U.S. military and the NATO force has been transferring security control of large amounts of territory over to Afghan security forces, and that process has really been completed. So certainly there are areas where the U.S. is still fighting, and that'll continue until the end of the year. But the idea is for there to be a turnover of security responsibilities, 100%, over to the Afghan military, and with the idea being that, you know, after this year, any troops that remain, international troops that remain, would not be fighting. They wouldn't be engaged in combat activities. They would just be providing training, equipment, moral support, and the like.
After the Obama administration announced the phase of the withdrawal, what happened in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, this goes back to what I said before, that I think that the U.S. enemy in Afghanistan can really feel emboldened, that realizing this war is about to end without any possibility or any clear possibility that the U.S. and the international forces would be winning. I mean, I think President Obama has always, he's not a president that likes war. I think he's always wanted to be looking at the exit strategy. And he could completely understand this. Why? I mean, it's a very unpopular war. He wants to get out. He spent his State of the Union speech talking about the need to prepare for leaving Afghanistan and bringing our troops home and getting them integrated back into civilian society. So there's always been this insistent theme on getting out. And I think that the Taliban and its allies are just very happy about this. Again, thinking that they've done a great job, and once the U.S. is gone, they'll be in a position to intensify their fight, which could have all kinds of possible implications, from causing chaos in Afghanistan to, though I don't think this is quite as realistic, coming back to power.
Why is it very difficult to win Afghanistan war? Tell us a little bit background of Afghanistan War I, after Afghanistan War II. That's I named that. I mean,
Right.
have several wars in Afghanistan.
Yeah, unfortunately, Afghanistan has had so many wars in its history. You could name quite a lot of numbers you can go up to. Basically, go back to what I said before. Afghanistan is a very difficult country to fight a war if you're fighting it with the assistance of the regime or the government in Afghanistan. There's no real strong legacy of a strong state willing to provide security forces and assistance. And also, it's physically, geographically, Afghanistan is a very forbidding country. It's in some parts it's desert, but it's really very mountainous and very cold in the winter, a lot of snow. And so it's just very difficult for foreign troops that don't really understand the terrain, aren't familiar with it, aren't used to the climate. Very difficult to fight. And the Americans have learned this, the Soviets learned this in the 1980s, the British learned this many years before. So to your question about wars in Afghanistan in the past, Afghanistan has always been seen as a prize for larger powers, just because of its geostrategic significance, its geographic location. You talk about Afghanistan the Afghanistan War I. I think what you're getting at is the Soviet intervention, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. And that was a war that lasted a really long time with a tremendous amount of deaths. And there were a lot of religious fighters, mujahideen, who fought against the Soviet presence. And these were troops that, interestingly enough, were supported and bankrolled to a large extent by both Pakistan and by the United States. That war, of course, ended with the Soviets withdrawing in 1989, and then much like today, with the current war, the United States really left, it disappeared militarily. Now, the war now, it's similar in the sense that, again, you have a large power that's involved, that intervened, though I would argue that the U.S.'s reasons for intervening in Afghanistan were a lot different than the Soviets' reasons, decades ago. But, you have a situation of a large power struggling to deal with pacifying, stabilizing the country, a lot of rivals. And this time what makes things different is that instead of having a very strategic ally on its side, Pakistan, the U.S. is dealing with the Pakistan that has a very different idea of what it wants to get out of the war in Afghanistan. So it's, in some cases, some similarities between the first war and the second war. I shouldn't use those terms, but the war in the 1980s and the war now. But at the same time, there are a lot of differences.
Right. What's the role the Pakistan government played in the two wars that you
Right.
mentioned?
Sure. Well, I mean, in the war in the 80s, the Pakistan government really had it did not want the Soviet-supported regime in power in Afghanistan. And this goes into Pakistan's deeper strategic interests, which really come down to the fact that Pakistan does not want any sort of outcome in Afghanistan that would encourage or intensify Indian influence or India's presence. India and Pakistan are longtime enemies. So for Pakistan, the idea was to try to do anything it could, and in this case, it involved providing support to fighters, to religious fighters from Pakistan or from Afghanistan that could expel this Soviet and Soviet-supported enemy.
So it's difficult. I think the Pakistan government have to involve in the wars. That means happened the area just they connect the two countries. That's true.
Yeah, well, I mean, Pakistan is critical. Whenever there's a war in Afghanistan, Pakistan is going to be critical. And not just because of its interests, which I was referring to before, but yeah, I mean, geographically, there's a border separating the two countries, but it's one of the largest and one of the most porous borders in the world. And so what's been happening with the current war in Afghanistan is a lot of Taliban fighters from Afghanistan are easily slipping into Pakistan and using these very wild, I shouldn't say wild, but just very difficult, violent areas of Pakistan, right over the border from Afghanistan, to really using these areas as a sanctuary, as a safe haven where they can't be attacked by U.S. troops or anyone else. And they use this sanctuary as a key strategy in its insurgency against the Afghan government. It launches attacks against the Afghan government from these Pakistani sanctuaries. So it goes into Afghanistan to fight. It goes back to Pakistan. For whatever reason, won't go into them, Pakistan's government and military has not really done anything about these sanctuaries. And that, of course, leads to more tensions with the United States. But yeah, it goes to your original point. Just because Pakistan is the bordering country with Afghanistan, it's going to play a key role in whatever happens in any sort of war or conflict in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm. What's the role does the U.S. government played in the two wars?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, in the war in the 1980s, it was a very different time from now. I mean, the Cold War dominated everything. So for the U.S., the objective was to remove, or really more realistically, contain the Soviet threat. And so the United States saw a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So for Washington back then, it was a very clear policy that the need was to beat back that intervention, expel the Soviets from Afghanistan. And back at that time, the U.S. and Pakistan had somewhat of a tricky, volatile relationship, but it was pretty good. They did see eye to eye on a number of issues, and one of them was on Afghanistan. So the U.S. government, not only was it intent on doing everything it could to get rid of the Soviets out of Afghanistan, but in finding allies that it could work with to make that happen, particularly allies that could provide interests and money and so forth. So, the U.S. Worked very closely with Pakistan and with Saudis and some other players to do everything it could to get the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The war now, you look at these in terms of similarities. Again, the U.S. has a very clear reason for wanting to be, or had a very clear reason for wanting to be in Afghanistan. The 9/11 attacks made the U.S. realize it had to do everything it could to get the Taliban out of power, because the Taliban had provided a sanctuary to Al-Qaeda, which had launched the 9/11 attacks. So at the time, for the United States, and really for now, for the U.S. government, the intent is really to do everything it can to ensure that the Taliban will never again come to power in Afghanistan and pose a threat to the U.S. And in the same lines, do everything it can to ensure that Al-Qaeda will never be strong enough to use Afghanistan as a launching pad for attacks against the U.S. And unfortunately, I think for political reasons, the Obama administration has tended to say, well, look, Al-Qaeda has been removed and is no longer a threat in Afghanistan. And in fact, that's not true. It's a weaker organization than it used to be. But let's face it, there still is an Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan and certainly in Pakistan. Al-Qaeda is now spread to the Middle East and North Africa. They're militant organizations that have been taking on its name. And really, its ideological power is still very powerful.